Well, howdy, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to pick back up our discussion of the Cold War, and we'll talk about the moment in time where the Cold War transitions from a policy of Brinkmanship, where the Americans and the Soviet Unions were really, and the Soviet Union were really willing to risk nuclear war at times to confront each other, toward a period known as Detente, which basically makes up the majority of the 1970s, where tensions cooled a little bit. We kind of accepted each other's existence to a certain degree. And although even in the midst of detente, there were still some aspects of Soviet society that we would have greatly disagreed with and even had some concerns about at a security level. But typically, if 1950 to 1965, the world was always this close to nuclear war, and the 1970s was more like that close to nuclear war. And ultimately, the detente era is actually going to end in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan to the American presidency. And Reagan, by then, is going to perceive some decline in the power of the Soviet Union that's going to encourage him to kind of ramp back up the level of force with which the Soviet threat was met, believing that he really could actually see the Soviet Union collapse. And they did. And he played a big part of it. It's a little bit of an oversimplification to say that he was the only part of it, but he was a major part of it. But nonetheless, we'll talk about how we get there. So when we kind of last left off the Cold War narrative here, we've kind of been all over the place. The thing about the Cold War that makes it hard to study is there's things going on in Asia, in Latin America, in Eastern Europe, in Western Europe, in North America, in South America, in Australia, in India, everywhere. So, because of that, it can get a little disjointed trying to keep the timeline together of all this stuff, and I apologize for that. I'm trying to streamline a little bit more than your book did, but I don't know if I succeeded in that or not. I gave it a go. But anyway, so there's a lot to study, but basically the period of time of the Eisenhower presidency, the Kennedy presidency, into the Johnson presidency, we kind of have this era of what we call Brinksmanship. There was one crisis after another. We've talked about the Berlin airlift incident. Following that, we had the government of East Germany went to another level and established the Berlin Wall, which is literally, they had so many people fleeing the communist part of the city of East Berlin that belonged to East Germany toward the western part that was democratic instead of communist. They had so many people fleeing that they built a wall to keep their citizens inside of the land. So that's not a good sign for how your country's doing when you have to build a wall to keep people in. So, we talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963, which is the closest we ever came to actual war with the Soviet Union. That, of course, was in response to the Cuban Revolution and the Bay of Pigs, the failed invasion that Cuban exiles backed by the United States made. And then we talked about the Vietnam War that America got involved in deeply in the late 1960s, after having been lightly involved in the early 60s. And the Vietnam War is an example of a tactic that both sides used a little bit during the Cold War, which is that of proxy war, which is where we don't want to fight each other because the Soviet Union and the United States both recognize that the other one is a bad man, so to speak, and you don't want to mess with them because they've got lots of guns and lots of men and lots of in the case of Americans, lots of money. And so you don't want to fight a war with them per se, but you do want to defeat their agenda, so you kind of pick fights with their less imposing allies. And for us, that was the Vietnam War. For Russia, that was the Afghanistan War of the 1980s, which we'll talk about probably in maybe a little bit today, but more in the next video, I imagine. So ultimately, though, there's an incident in the early 60s as well, where an American spy plane, a type of plane known as a U-2, crash lands in Russia and reveals the extent to which America had been spying on the Soviets. They get upset about that. That ruins some nuclear arms talks that we had been considering. And, in this class, I hadn't talked much about how deep the Soviet espionage apparatus was in the United States. If you're interested, watch my American history video, Post-War Politics. I'll talk about that in more detail. But they were spying on us with great gusto, and we were returning the favor. The coolest thing, if you ever go to Washington, D.C., the coolest thing there to me is this thing called the International Spy Museum, and it's got all these old spy gadgets from the 60s and 70s and all these sorts of things we've learned from declassified information, and talked about some of the ways that the Americans and Russians are spying on each other. And it was just some wild stuff. I mean, the James Bond movies weren't as unrealistic as you might think. So they... there was this one story that I remember from there that was really cool, where there had been a new Soviet embassy built in the United States. Of course, it was built by American construction workers, so we were going to bug it, obviously, and the Soviets knew we were going to bug it. By bug it, I mean put in like a listening device. Well, of course, I mean the Russians know we're going to do this, and we know that they know that we're going to do this. So what we did was we put the listening device inside a cement block. Also inside of that cement block was a remote-activated drill. And after we knew that the Soviets had swept the place for bugs, we then used the remote to activate this little remote-controlled drill that drilled a hole in a cement block inside the fountain, just strong enough for us to be able to listen to conversations going on inside the building. I mean, just insane stuff like this. So, espionage was a big thing. Proxy wars was a big thing. We were fighting a major public relations and propaganda campaign against each other. America started radio stations called Radio Free Europe that would broadcast anti-communist propaganda into, and I don't mean propaganda in a bad sense. I mean, what they were saying was good. They were, blasting pro-democracy messages into the Soviet-dominated nations of Eastern Europe. And so Stalin dies in the late or the mid-1950s. Mid might even be a little. It was kind of more the early 50s. So Stalin dies in the early 50s. He was replaced by a fellow by the name of Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev continues Soviet expansionism in a number of ways. He was the guy who was in charge when he and Kennedy played nuclear chicken with the world in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But Khrushchev, if you had been around in Russia during the times of Stalin, even Nikita Khrushchev, as terrible as he was, would seem like a breath of fresh air, because he came in and he started a process known as de-Stalinization, which is basically where they tried to move the Soviet Union away from Stalinism to a certain degree. So they kind of started to treat Stalin as though he were a bad guy, not a hero of the revolution. He made a speech when he became the leader against the idea of a personality cult, encouraged a little bit more deliberation inside of how the Communist Party is run, changed things to where no one man could ever dominate the Soviet Union to the degree that Stalin did, and he allowed just a little bit more religious and political freedom. So you start to have a few Russian dissidents are able to write a little bit more than they would have been able to under Stalin. There's still lots of people going to gulags, but not as much as it had been, but still a lot. Not enough that you can say, okay, it's over, Russia's okay now. No. You still run a very good chance of being imprisoned for criticizing the government. There's still some persecution of the church, all this kind of stuff. But we're talking about degrees, it was a little bit better than under Stalin. But some of the Eastern European nations where the Russians had put in puppet governments when at the end of World War II, these places like Poland, Hungary, Lithuania, all these countries that are supposedly independent but really weren't. Some of them start to wonder maybe if they could take advantage of Khrushchev's slightly more slightly less dictatorial tendencies, to actually become more like independent countries for real and not just in name. And so some of these Eastern European presidents start to try to flex their muscles, and the Soviet Union proves that it has not fundamentally changed in its expansionistic goals by the way they handle this challenge. So the first one is 1956 in Hungary, which was, again, one of these Soviet satellite states. The leader of Hungary was a communist by the name of Imre Nagy. And Nagy was still a communist. He was still a hard leftist. He was still on team communism. But he wanted to kind of function independently of the Soviet Union, or at least gain a little more independence. And he wanted to kind of add some of his own twist to the way Hungary was doing things. Wanted to have a little bit more independence. And there was actually a lot of unrest and dislike toward communism in Hungary. The Hungarian people were not necessarily big supporters of the Communist Party. So Nagy tries to break away. And the response of the Soviet Union is to militarily invade, flood the capital city with tanks, have Nagy excommunicated from the party, and reinstall a more loyal puppet. So Hungary becomes the first Eastern European nation to really try to buck the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union strikes back hard. They don't allow it, and they use brutality to impose their will over Hungary. So just in case anyone was wondering, are we a lot safer and things a lot nicer with Khrushchev? Khrushchev still showed he may not be Joseph Stalin, but he still is a communist dictator. So he's not going to be a great guy. When Khrushchev dies, he is replaced by a fellow named Leonid Brezhnev. And Brezhnev rules the Soviet Union from 68 until 82. And Brezhnev is there for much of this thawing out period that we'll call Detente. But before he starts to make some, Detente overtures, he demonstrates his communist dictator credentials. So Khrushchev had opened up a little bit of space, just a little bit of space for dissenters and stuff. Brezhnev comes in hard, wanting to kind of restore. And so Brezhnev brings back some of the repression of Stalinist Russia. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was probably the most famous of all the Russian dissidents. He wrote a book called The Gulag Archipelago that's considered by most people to be one of the greatest books ever written, where he went deep into life inside of the Gulag, as he had actually survived a Stalinist Gulag. And emerged to tell the tale and wrote about it. And Khrushchev had given him like a little bit of, leeway to not get murdered. Brezhnev decides to kind of bring the hammer down on Solzhenitsyn and people like him. Solzhenitsyn winds up getting expelled from the country. He was too famous at that point to kill without there being an international incident. But they kick him out of the Soviet Union. He actually comes here and finishes his life here. Brezhnev starts persecuting dissenters, steps up religious persecution, steps up persecution of political opponents. And Brezhnev faces a similar crisis in Czechoslovakia to what Khrushchev had in Hungary, where the Czechoslovak government was wanting to move away from the Soviet system. Let me make sure I'm pronouncing this guy's name correctly here. Alexander Dubček was the name of the Czechoslovak leader. And he was still a socialist, but he kind of wanted to introduce some more democratic type reforms into Czechoslovakia, kind of back off the hardcore Stalinism or communism. And, Brezhnev says no way. And so Brezhnev comes with the hammer and once again imposes his will on Czechoslovakia in much the same way Khrushchev had done Hungary. So twice within a 10-year period, you've got Eastern European nations that are supposed to be independent nations basically just trying to act like an independent nation. In no case trying to even step away from socialism, for the most part not even really stepping away from communism. but just trying to add a couple little wrinkles or do their own thing in some ways. The Soviets came in and said, you are listed as a member of the United Nations, but you're not really independent. You got to do what we say. And Brezhnev actually writes out, if you remember us talking about the Truman Doctrine a couple episodes ago, where episodes like I have a show, like anyone would watch this if they didn't have to. The Truman Doctrine was this statement, that we're going to oppose communist aggression, anywhere that it goes. Well, the Brezhnev Doctrine was the opposite. That said, any place that tries to leave communism, that tries to leave the orbit of the Soviet Union reserved the right to use force against it. So the Brezhnev Doctrine is this very aggressive statement that if any of you other Eastern European countries try to get out of line and try to leave the alliance, we're coming after you. However, one area where the Russians did not have enough influence to stop them from breaking with the team was with the Chinese. We talked about that a little in the lesson on Mao's China, where China and Russia actually stopped getting along. And Stalin and Mao had signed a 30-year alliance between the two countries, but their alliance broke actually, 20 years before that treaty it was supposed to have run out, because the Soviets just assumed that the Chinese would accept, little brother status between the two of them, and Mao very quickly was like, actually, I feel like I should be leading the communist world, and China, was actually a little bit of a challenge to the Soviet Union for communist leadership, and China even starts kind of exporting Maoist versions of communism to certain countries in Africa. So ultimately, what happens is the Soviet Union and China actually split apart. The Soviets stopped giving the Chinese arms. They stopped sending them money. And at one point in the mid-'60s, the relationship gets so bad that there's actually a short-lived war between forces on the border of Russia and China. They never officially declare full-scale war and go, and all that, but there are skirmishes, there are battles that go on between Russian and Chinese troops, and that is important to kind of some of the next developments in the politics here. So, 1968, Vietnam War is raging in the United States. An anti-war movement is really emerging that's opposing the war in a way that no war had ever been opposed in American history. And with that, Lyndon Johnson, who started the war, retires, going into 68, and the presidency swings from Johnson, the Democrat, to the Republican nominee Richard Nixon, who beats the Vice President Hubert Humphrey for the presidency. Nixon runs, on a policy of law and order and stuff like this, kind of opposing some of the unrest that had been going on in America. Nixon was an odd cat because he had built his reputation in American politics as one of the most foremost anti-communist in the Congress. He was the chairman in the 1950s of a congressional committee known as the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC. And they were a committee that was there to root out communists from areas of American society. And they did a lot of investigations of communist spy rings, but they also did a lot, and a lot of these communist spy rings, I should say too, were very, very high up in American society. Alger Hiss, who was Roosevelt's chief advisor at the Yalta Conference that really set the map for the post-World War II world, was a communist spy, and that's been proven. The Soviets got the nuclear bomb because of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg and Klaus Fuchs, who had been Soviet spies. So HUAC was formed to kind of prevent stuff like that from happening, but they kind of crossed the line a few times into kind of harassing a lot of leftists who were peaceable in American society, especially in whether it's in colleges or Hollywood or different places. But anyway, Nixon, though, had this reputation as a diehard anti-communist. And the funny thing about that is that it actually gave him more leeway than most candidates would have had to actually make peace overtures. There's the old saying, as we'll see, only Nixon could have gone to China, and you'll understand what that means more in a second. So Nixon comes in, and he is a believer in a political philosophy that is realpolitik, or realistic politics. We mentioned this earlier in the context of talking about Otto von Bismarck back before, remember back in the glory days when you actually could have class in a room with people and we could see each other. Remember those days? Feels like a long time ago now. But anyway, so the idea of realpolitik, it was basically a view of politics that was kind of devoid of romanticism. It's all about balance of power and great power politics. And this is a change from, the last 20 years of American presidents. Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson had all kind of conducted the Cold War on a fairly moralistic front where we're trying to fight communism as an idiot. And Nixon actually says, the main thing is we want to maintain, basically he wants to back off like promoting democracy and stuff like that and move more in favor of making sure we have peaceful coexistence with the Soviets, not wanting them to get too powerful, and just trying to make sure that, that we can maintain peace. So, and a lot of this is influenced by his Secretary of State. He's a highly influential diplomat by the name of Henry Kissinger. So, Nixon and Kissinger start to try to work on this policy of détente, and this continues through the administration of Gerald Ford, and then a third president, Jimmy Carter. So this is a bipartisan phenomenon. Carter was a Democrat, Nixon and Ford were Republicans. Although the détente thing was always more popular with liberals than it was with the conservatives. The conservative movement was always very skeptical of détente, thought that it was giving too much power to communism by just kind of accepting it in a way that, Truman and Eisenhower and Kennedy had not. So one of the things, so Nixon wants to get the Soviets to the negotiating table to start negotiating some treaties to bring down the level of weaponry that was out in the world, because the amount of weapons that were out there had gotten insane. In the 50s, we moved from the atomic bomb to the hydrogen bomb, which is like a dozen times more powerful than the bombs we dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. And those were, again, 2,000 tons of TNT is what we dropped on, is the equivalent of the one nuclear bomb that we dropped on Hiroshima. And the hydrogen bomb is 10 times that. And both sides have these now. And not only do both sides have these now, but they've figured out how to make like missile warheads attached to airplanes and submarines where they can be delivered with precision without having to fly over the target in the same way that we had to in Nagasaki, Hiroshima. So, I mean, they literally could just press a button and there's nuclear warheads flying across the ocean, unmanned. So, both sides had literally put together enough explosives to blow the world up multiple times. And everyone just kind of, people were starting to think that perhaps this is just an unsafe situation just to have this many weapons sitting around. And so a lot of people start pushing for nuclear disarmament, and they want to kind of talk down, they want to decrease the amount of weapons that are out in the world. And even President Reagan, who's considered to be the man who ends détente, is actually still a supporter of nuclear disarmament. He just wants it to be done after the Soviet Union has kind of been put in its place in certain ways, and after he can find a leader he can trust, which takes a little while. So Nixon wants to move in this direction, but he also knows he has to be negotiating from a position of strength. And so there's a couple things that he does to try to do that. One is he wants to get America out of Vietnam. We talked about that in the previous video. Moves through this policy of Vietnamitization. It signs the Paris Peace Accords, gets us out of Vietnam. The idea was if the North invades again, we'll go back in. By the time that happens, Nixon had been impeached for a scandal known as the Watergate scandal that we'll talk about next year in American history. By then there was no one was gonna send troops back into Vietnam again. So North Vietnam runs things over. But so he wants to get out of Vietnam, and the other thing he wants to do is to make an ally out of China. And this was pretty controversial because in doing so, it was a little bit of a betrayal of Taiwan, who we had always treated as the one true China. We had not given official diplomatic relations and recognition to Mao. and his communist government. We had recognized the nationalist government that persisted on the island of Taiwan as a legitimate government of China. Nixon actually recognizes the so-called People's Republic of China as an independent nation. And the reason he wants to do that is to take advantage of what they called the Sino-Soviet split, which was the division where the Soviet Union and China stopped getting along. He wanted to say, well, while the Soviet Union and China are not getting along, why don't we get China to move over to our side in conflicts? Now, this only happens if you have a realpolitik mindset. If you're still thinking in terms of like this kind of moral crusade to rid the world of communism, look, Mao didn't change nothing over this, okay? Communist China remained a terrible dictatorship that does unconscionable things to their people. You know, it is after this period of time where we gave them diplomatic recognition that they started doing things like the one-child policy, where they literally forced all Chinese families to have abortions on any child past the firstborn. So, I mean, don't think that China just becomes nice because we signed a friendship pact, but we wanted to like turn them against the Soviet Union so that when we come into negotiations about things, the Chinese would be taking our side in those negotiations. And Nixon's opening up relations with China is a really huge deal for the history of the world from this point, because it does allow, moving forward in the late 80s, early 90s, especially in the 90s, we start increasing the level at which we trade with China. And so, you know, you probably there's a very good chance that you're wearing a shirt right now that's made in China, that you've got all kind of cheap stuff around your house that is made in China. So we started stepping up our trade with China significantly. And that enabled the China to become one of the powers of the world. And you know, when we started trading with China, we really kind of, you know, thought that it was going to create there was a lot of research that suggested that, you know, that by giving economic freedom, it would cause a movement for political freedom. Instead, it kind of went in the opposite direction. They gave people enough economic freedom to get the country more prosperous, but never really enabled a lot of freedom in terms of dissenting from the government or practicing religion freely or things like that. And now the current leadership of China under Xi Jinping he's probably the worst leader China has had since Mao for human rights abuses. But we really, you know, there was some belief that, you know, trade with China was going to bring some change in terms of the way the Chinese communists treated their people. But that really wasn't why Nixon did it. Nixon really wasn't that concerned with that. You know, Eisenhower would have been, 15 years ago when Nixon was Eisenhower's VP. But by now, Nixon just wants them on the side of us when it comes time to negotiate arms treaties. 1972 is when we signed the first of the so-called SALT treaties, that is Strategic Arms Limitation Talk. So Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or the SALT. And so they signed the first SALT treaty, is signed by Nixon and Brezhnev in 1972, which set a cap on how many intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, that is missiles that you can shoot that have the distance to travel across continents, and how many submarine launched missiles each country could have. And in 1975, 33 nations joined the U.S. and the USSR in signing a joint commitment to Detente, Detente is a French word that means thawing. So everyone is talking about the Cold War, and so Detente is like the idea of a thawing of the Cold War, or like the ice melting a little bit. So we signed this peace deal called the Helsinki Accords, which basically pledged 33 nations to trying to tone down tensions. But a couple things are going to happen that is going to bring an end to the Detente period. Part of that is the election of the a little bit more militaristic Reagan in the United States, but a lot of that is also a resumption of much more militaristic activity on the part of the Soviet Union in the late 70s. So we have this period of Detente, and then there's a major game changer in 1979, I believe it was. So by then, we're going to look at the Middle East next week. We'll go through the chronology of the Cold War in Europe, and then we'll move back and look at the Mideast. But in 1979, it's the year that the modern Middle East is born with the Iranian Revolution and all this kind of stuff. But in addition to that, Afghanistan, which is in Central Asia, not technically the Middle East, but it's a Muslim land in Central Asia, and it neighbored the Soviet Union. They had a communist regime in power through much of the 70s. There's a rebellion against that regime in Afghanistan. The Soviets send troops in 78 or 79. The Soviets send troops into Afghanistan to prop up the communist regime and to try to conquer the land, and they have about as easy time with it as we do. Afghanistan is a very, very rugged and mountainous terrain. And there's hills and caves and it's really harsh land, and it is almost impossible for one government to centralize control over the whole thing. This is especially true if that government is a foreign invader. And throughout the years, many people have tried to invade that land and failed. Even in literally your entire lifetime, American forces have been in Afghanistan, and we've not yet been able to fully accomplish the mission we set out to do in 2001, which we'll hopefully, if everything goes according to plan, we'll be able to talk about that in the last week of school. But the Soviets have about as easy time there as we would wind up having. And the Soviet-Afghan War is the Soviet Union's Vietnam. It's a huge drain on their resources. It's a huge drain on their manpower. And it also undoes a lot of the goodwill of Detente, because here the Soviets are signing the Helsinki Accord, saying, "Oh, look at us, we're going to give up all these weapons, and we're going to start being friendly to the United States and are friendlier," and then the next thing you know, they're launching a full-scale invasion of a neighbor in a war of conquest to spread communism. And this is going to undo a lot of the goodwill. At the time, by now, the American president was a fellow named Jimmy Carter, who's not one of our better ones. Carter was working really hard to get another arms reduction treaty to go a little further. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan kind of messes with that. He ultimately we wind up boycotting, an Olympics that was going to be in the Soviet Union as a sign of disapproval, but ultimately Carter's not really able to do anything to talk the Soviets out of what they were doing. So 1980, Carter's becoming unpopular because the American economy is in shambles, and ultimately the election is won by the greatest president since George Washington, or, well, maybe since Abraham Lincoln, but the greatest president of the 20th century by far, Ronald Reagan. I'm not a fan of dictatorship, but if I could raise Reagan from the dead and make him king, I'm not sure I wouldn't think about it. But Reagan becomes president in 1980, and he begins to notice something that other people had not, which is he starts to see a little bit more weakness on the part of Soviet Union than what people had thought, and he kind of steps up the level of aggression in fighting the Cold War. And to that story, we will turn in our next lesson.